Hi, I'm Dr. Frank A. Thomas with another version of the African American Legacy Preaching Series, where we seek to bring you the very best and brightest of African American preachers who have impacted the world and impacted a generation. And so we have as our very special guest, Bishop Vashti McKenzie, who is retired from the AME Church. So thank you so much for being with us, and it is our pleasure to have you. And so just thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here and to share. Thank you. It's an important work, so thank you for including me in it.
Oh yeah, we could not do it without you. Couldn't do it without you. You've done such groundbreaking work that probably a lot of our audience knows who you are and are familiar with your work. But just in case there might be some folks who don't know, what would you like for them to know about Bishop Vashti McKenzie?
I would like for them to know that Vashti Murphy McKenzie is a called out woman of God who has a passion for the gospel, who absolutely loves to preach. The process of preaching can be devastating, but I love to preach. She pastored not just the people within the walls of the church, but she pastored the neighborhood as well. And in being elevated and elected a bishop, then I had an opportunity to pastor states and countries. And now with the National Council of Churches, I have an opportunity to provide executive pastoral responsibilities of 37 denominations. And so that she worked hard, she tried, she cared, loves the creative process. She's a visionary, and she's Ida and Ed baby girl.
So let's start there. So give me the beginnings and where and how you have come to be bishop.
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, born and raised on the west side. It's a very important, Baltimore people understand that, but grew up on the west side of Baltimore, product of Baltimore City Public Schools. I attended Robert Brown Elliott School number 104, Colored School number 9, etched across the top of that old brick building in cement. And enjoyed being there. Wonderful neighborhood, you walk to school. Your Sunday school teachers are your teachers. The principal is the Sunday school superintendent, So it was like a wonderful, homogeneous community. And then integration came, and you're bussed across town into a totally different world. And so you learn now how to navigate new spaces. Graduated from Eastern High School through Morgan State University to graduate from the University of Maryland, then Howard University School of Divinity, and then finally United Theological Seminary, where I got my doctorate. So that's just a long education process. But I grew up in a journalist family. I grew up in a family of writers. Everybody was a writer, everybody was an editor. My great-grandfather, John H. Murphy, was a publisher of a black newspaper. Started 40 years ago at a time when only 0.5% of black people could read. And so he was a freedman, whitewasher by trade, and wanted to have a business where all of his 10 children could work with dignity and integrity, where you were respected, no one was going to call you boy or by your first name, where you could work. And his wife, Martha, as the family legend goes, gave him $250 of the butter and egg money, and he bought the printing press, brought all the things that you need to do, and the Afro-American newspaper began, and it grew to be one of the largest chains of black weekly newspapers on the East Coast, joining all the other black newspapers that were, like the Los Angeles Sentinel, the New York Amsterdam, joining that crowd as they were emerging in the late 1800s. And so it's still a family business. It's still alive today. Of course, it's morphed into digital spaces now. And so my environment was around writers. Of course, as a wonderful teenager, I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not going to be me. But when you grow up in a family of writers and journalists, then everybody has something to say. So I always knew I had something to say. I just didn't know where the saying of it was going to be. And then growing up in the atmosphere, my grandfather, who was a language teacher at Howard University, he was in charge of the department there, where he met my grandmother, and they married, and off to that part of the story. And his father, of course, was ill, and he wanted his son, Carl Murphy, my grandfather, to come back from Washington, D.C. to run the newspaper, and so he did. And as the publisher of the Afro-American newspaper, he was very social justice minded, very community centered. Thurgood Marshall says if it wasn't for Carl Murphy, there would not be a Brown versus the Board of Education, because he raised money to pay for the case, to help support it that way. And he supported the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But my grandfather didn't have any sons. He had 5 daughters. Wow. And so I grew up in an atmosphere where your gender didn't determine what you did. Your skill set determined what you did. So my aunts were editors, publishers. My one aunt, Vashti, was a member of the 688, that is the Black female Army Corps that served in London, and served in England, rather, in the European theater. My other aunt, Elizabeth Murphy Moss, she served as a war correspondent in the European theater. I have another aunt who was a publisher. My mother was an advertising marketing pioneer, and then retired from advertising, and then went on to be entertainment editor. So she traveled the world and interviewed who's who of who's who. And so I grew up in this atmosphere where your gender just didn't determine what you do. It was your skill set. And so in growing up in that environment, the sky was never the limit. It was always beyond. It was always beyond.
Yeah. Tell me about your mom and dad.
My mother and father, Ida and Ed, Samuel Edward, and my mother, Ida Murphy Smith, and then later Peters. My father was a track star at the University of Wisconsin at a time when black men were not supposed to be at the University of Wisconsin, but he was, and he was a contemporary of Jesse Owens. So I grew up with his medals and trophies all over the place. And he was good at it. He was very good at it. My mother was at the University of Wisconsin at the same time, studying journalism, of course, and they met and married, and then came back to Baltimore to be in the family business. Everybody was in the family business. So my mother was an advertising manager and marketing person. So she was always the Mrs. Santa. She ran the Clean Block campaign, which was one of the first environmental city campaigns ever in the United States, started by my great aunt, Frances Murphy. And so it was a wonderful, 2-parent family growing up. My older brother, who was a football athlete, all this other kind of stuff, following in his father's footsteps, and growing up in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell me now about your call.
Well, like I said, I always knew I had something to say. I just didn't know the venue or the process to do it. I met my husband when I was at Morgan, and we married. He was an NBA player, and the expansion draft happened. This is in the 60s. They were expanding from 10 teams to whatever, and he was taken in the expansion draft, and so we went to the Southwest in Phoenix. And in Phoenix, what did I do? Well, I wrote for the Arizona Republic. I mean, you come from a journalist family. You've been writing all your life, writing obituaries. That's how they start young journalists off, right? You're on the city desk writing obituaries. And when my husband retired, we came back to Baltimore. of course, I went back to writing for the newspaper, but I knew there was something else to do. I knew that I wanted to expand. Met Kathy Hughes, who was starting a radio station in Washington, D.C., a gospel radio station. I had met her husband in media before, in the Washington area, and Dewey called and says, McKenzie, I think this is something that suits you, because I had given my life to Christ. I was in Bethel, Baltimore. John Bryant was the pastor. And I believe that every Christian has a call. And your responsibility to faith is to serve somehow, whether it's in the choir, the usher, whatever. In some capacity, you are to serve God. So I took that this is my way to serve God in Christian broadcasting. And so did I know anything about Christian? Didn't know a thing. I knew music because I grew up playing the piano. I went to Peabody. My grandfather was very big on, there are no black students over here, so you're going, whether you want to or not. And so off you went. So I knew music, understood music, loved gospel music. And they put me on the air. And so I was holding down the midday spot. And at that time, you would have to have a license to be on the air. And so I said, I don't have a license. And so Kathy says, don't worry about it. We'll get an engineer to run your show, and you go study to get your third-class engineer license. So I went off and studied to get my process. And so I'm on the air, and I'm in the midst of all this music. And then I began to notice that, in the conversations with people in the phone, that something was happening. These people were falling between the cracks. Either they didn't have a church home, or they didn't have a pastor, or they were in a place where they were not being fed. They had needs, and needs were not being met. And so I began to pray and say, okay, God, what's this all about? And so the Lord says, I want you to gather 7 people wise and full of the Holy Spirit, straight out of Acts, the 6th chapter, right? Straight out of the Acts, the 6th chapter. So I called some friends and I said, hey, come on, let's meet. I think we need to do something. Right. And so I invited 9.
Okay.
7 showed up, right? God said, I told you 7, right? I told you 7. And so we began this community service organization. Right, this community service organization, where we were going to try to help people, and we started a 24-hour hotline where people could call, and we could refer them to help. And so some of the 7 went off and got trained to do all this, and we started it. Do we know how to do it? No, we didn't know how to do this. We just connecting the dots here, and so we put that all together. And at the end of the day, out of that 7, 2 became bishops and 6 became preachers. Finally answering that. And various denominations, Church of God in Christ, Baptist, Methodist, non-denominational, in various process. If you had said to us that this was a ministry, we would have told you no. Right. We told you no. And so increasingly, I wanted to talk more when I'm on the air than I wanted to play music, of course. The owner, look, your job here is to play the music, you're not to talk. So I put together something what I call the spiritual vitamin. And so every morning I gave, by this time I went from on air to program director, operations manager, In my mind, I'm getting ready to own a radio station, okay? I'm following the path of Kathy Hughes, I am on my way, I'm moving up to the top, but I just had to have my spiritual vitamin in the morning. Well, now I know these are like little mini sermons.
Right.
Then I said, people just need something to begin the day, right. Something to help them out. The management changed, the ownership changed, and I felt we were in conflict between this is a ministry. To them, it was a business. I was only one of 2 women in the Washington market who were program directors, because women weren't supposed to be program directors. Right. And then I got promoted to operations manager, and it was difficult being in an environment for the first time in my life who counted my gender and not my gift. Because remember, I grew up in a place where, your gender was inconsequential. But no, here, in this environment, in Washington, like the 8th market in the whole United States, my gender counted or discounted me from being who I was. So just as being moved from your wonderful homogeneous neighborhood to a different neighborhood when you're integrating middle school, and all of a sudden you had to fight for who you were, and you had to fight, you had a right to be there, and you had a right to use your gifts. Remember, I had piano lessons all my life. Mrs. Swan lived next door. And then I'm in Peabody, and you get to school and he says, well, we don't know whether you can play piano here. Let's give you a musicianship test. Seriously? You go through that. Now I'm here in this other environment where as program director, you're supposed to do things. It's like marketing and advertising. I watched it all my life with my mother, right? So we're doing this marketing and process, and you're sitting in the middle of a staff meeting, and your boss laughs at you. What kind of program is this? This is what? Oh. And so all the other men in the room, they're all laugh at you. And so I go home and, walk in the door. My husband looks in the face, say, it happened again? I said, yeah. And I just slide to the floor in tears. I said, God, what is this? What is this? What is happening? And then get up and go back to work the next day. And next week you're in another staff meeting, and your boss presents your program that you were ridiculed for last year. And everybody celebrates. Oh, what a wonderful idea. This is great. This is great. This is going to put us in the top 10. We were already in the top 10, but it's going to put you in the top 10. So I began to pray. I said, God, what absolutely is this process that's going to happen? So I am in Bethel. That's a story in itself, because I wasn't raised Methodist, but I'm in Bethel. And I say to my pastor, I said, well, I'm not called to preach, because you got 21 preachers here, and all the bases are covered, and there's nothing here for me to do. So I know this is not for me. This is not for me. And then, of course, in this prayer and fasting, I asked God, I said, if you really want me to do this, because if you wanted me to do this, God, why didn't you get me when I was 16? Because all the preachers I knew were called from childhood. This can't be. I'm getting ready to be, by this time I was not just program manager, but I was now general manager, not of this station, another station in Baltimore, and on track to become a corporate vice president. And after that, president, and after that, I'm going to own my own station. So if you really wanted me to do this, you would have caught me back there. I have my 5 and 10 year plan. I don't have time for this. Right. And so God and I are bargaining back and forth. And increasingly, I am moving from the center of the church to the back of the church. And now I'm sitting in the balcony because I'm scared something's going on up here. And the closer I get, something's going to happen. And so I'm bargaining with God. I said, well, God, if you really, really, really want me to preach and serve in this capacity, you're just going to have to show me today. And so Bishop Bryant, then Pastor Bryant, he's preaching. And he, opens the doors of the church. He says, turn to the person next to you and tell them your testimony. So I turn to the person next to me. I'm, telling my testimony. And then invite them to give their lives to Christ. And I did, and they did. And I said, you got to go down there now. And so they did. And they all go in the back. And so the pastor says, do you have anything to say? And he said yes. And he said, I am not a he, I'm a she. And God said something to me that tells me I need to live my life differently. I fell out. I mean, literally fell out in the balcony. And I'm in, drenched in tears. And then the next Sunday, Cecilia Bryant is preaching, and she preaches a sermon called The Call Sent. I couldn't get to the balcony that Sunday. I stood in the narthex of the church through the whole service. I couldn't get to the balcony. And then I couldn't say no anymore. And I came down the aisle, and of course Bishop knew, he knew. They all knew, everybody knew but me. I mean, he said, why didn't y'all just tell me? We could have avoided this, right? Bishop says to me, so why are you here? I said, I must be about my Father's business. And he says, what does that mean? I said, I'm meant to preach. And I said, yes, in a puddle of tears. I'm sure everybody doesn't come like that, but that is, it was a process. Yeah. It was a process, but I knew when I was a child, this is called reflecting. I knew when I was a church and a child, there was something there. It was a quieter church. But there was something about the holy hush, and you could feel it, and I could feel it as a child. My brother was an acolyte. Girls weren't allowed to be acolytes. And I said, why? But there was something about every time you approached the altar, you could just feel it. Oh, it would just feel it. You couldn't explain it, didn't know what was going on. Until I went into Bethel. You got tissues? I'm going to cry. Thank you. Until I walked into Bethel Church, and my cousin had invited me, who, we all grew up together, invited me. And she said, come. So finally we all came, the whole family came, my mother, everybody, we all came. And my son at that time was about 16, 18 months. He was a hip baby, hip babies. And I walked into the church and I went like, ooh, something's here, something's happening. And we were standing and singing and, going through the whole order service. And I just took my son, I just threw him at my husband and said, you hold him, I can't hold him. And I had to sit down. And I knew something was happening, and I held on to the back of the pew with both hands. I mean, like white knuckles, right? Holding on to the back, because I knew if I let go, I was gonna go down that aisle. And I'm holding on, and I'm just shaking and shaking and shaking. And so Eleanor Bryant, John Bryant's sister, came to the back of the church and she says, God's calling you. No, he's not. I'm holding on to the pew with dear life. And I go home and I ask my husband, I said, what happened? He says, oh, it's just, he came from a more charismatic background. He says, oh, it's just the move of the Holy Spirit. It's okay. And I said, all right. And I asked my mother, I said, Mom, what happened? And she said, oh, it's just an emotional service, I asked my dad, what happened? He said, it's just a cathartic response to worship. And I'm going like, no. Something is happening. And it's not something, it's someone. And so I said to my family, I said, I'm going to go back. But no, your church over here. I said, no, I'm going over here because I need to find out what this is. And so here I am. Wow.
So then from that, there's the educational journey, I'm assuming. So tell me about that, because that seemed to be the next logical step. In my thinking, may not be, but.
It is. I told, told my pastor, and he explained the process. You have to have a seminary degree to be ordained in this Methodist process, as in a 2-tier ordination, first the diaconate, then the elder orders. And so I was already in school. I was at Maryland getting a master's degree. And I was really torn between whether I was going to go get an MBA at the University of Baltimore or whether I was going to get my master's at Maryland. And he says, well, all that's got to stop because you got to go to seminary. cancel all of that. God has already trumped your plans about what you think you're going to do. So I chose Howard. I wanted to go to Howard. Some of my contemporaries were going to St. Mary's. I didn't want to go to St. Mary's. I wanted to go to Howard because Dolores Carpenter was at Howard. And I wanted to study with Dolores Carpenter. O.B. Wright was at Howard. And I wanted to learn with O.B. Wright. And Kane Hope Felder was at Howard. And I wanted to learn from the eminent Black New Testament scholar there is. I'm in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is predominantly a African diaspora denomination. So I wanted to be in a place where I could learn, because this is what I'm going to be doing. This is going to be my setting. And so I went to Howard. It was a wonderful experience. It was still in a day where women were an anomaly. They were rare. It was one of only, two of only, three of only. And being in a classroom setting where male students were not necessarily happy that you were there. But I felt later on in reflecting that I had been prepared for that all my life. Integrating School 18 up on the hill, being in a classroom where people didn't think you should be there. Going to Morgan, I wanted to be a historian, just researcher. I didn't, and sitting in a classroom where the teacher says, the education department is down the hall. I said, okay, but I'm in this class. I'm paying money to be in this class. He says, oh, you're not going to be a teacher. Women are teachers. Men are researchers. I said, I'm here to be in this class. And so now I'm in seminary, where one of few, or some, in a class where women were not expected to be. But Dean Jones never treated any of the women in his class as if they were not called to preach. Kane Hope Felder never treated the women in their class as if you were not called. And it was, they challenged us. I mean, Dean Lawrence Jones came in and told us this: we're gonna stomp all over your belief systems. You're gonna stomp all over the belief systems. And preachers would say, all right, you're going to seminary. You go and save. Don't forget to come back saved. It's going to be all right. But Kane Hope Felder was Dolores and Kane Hope Felder were just absolutely wonderful. You have to be masochistic to be in Kane Hope Felder's class because he worked you. Right. He worked you. But if you were able to survive the class, and he tells you, right, nobody gets an A. Nobody gets an A. So if you get through the class and you get a decent grade, you get an A minus. You never really get an A out of Kane Hope Felder. You find yourself going back again, because as hard as he was making us better than what we ever could be. Making us better than we ever could be. And so that was a wonderful experience, and I graduated. Started to pastor in the midst of that. And then when I graduated, I said, we ain't going no more. Then a couple of years later, boom, you're back at it again, Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. So was there a preaching professor in Howard?
Yes, Dean Crawford.
And did you take the preaching class?
I did. Well, we always had to take preaching class. You had to take the preaching class. But Dean Crawford didn't treat us any different than any other person. He exposed us to a lot of preachers that we only heard in name only. But then that was when they were, I hate to tell you how long ago that was, but that was when these sermons were recorded on albums. They were not recorded on tape. And so we heard Franklin on tape, on record, we heard the Harvard Hooper.
Charles Adams.
Yes, Charles Adams. And
C.L. Franklin.
Yeah, C.L. Franklin. on record, and of course King on record and others. And it was the first time we ever heard that, so it was just wonderful to be exposed to hear them.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me some now about your preaching and some of your preaching mentors, a person who really helped evolve you into the preacher that you are today.
Well, there were, of course, mostly men who were coming along at the same, who were preaching. My pastor insisted that whenever there was a certain preacher, or let's say good preaching, that we who are students of preaching need to be there. So we found ourselves in the car on a Thursday night going to Philadelphia because the preacher's in town. So we did that. You need to go to Hampton every year. We didn't have no money. We're young. We're raising children, and we're paying tuition, and we're pastoring a church that only pays you $25, as your salary. We didn't have no money. But we would get in the car 4 and 6 at a time, and we would go to Hampton, and we had enough money to get one hotel room. And we spent that week immersed, and it was a wonderful time at Hampton, because every day we talked church. We talked preaching. We listened, and we just took it all in. And then at night, go to Daryl's and eat hot fudge sundaes when we were young enough to eat hot fudge sundaes at midnight, right? And talk preaching and talk church. And it's a wonderful experience. So Charles Adams, I admired him. He would exegete the text to the minutest degree.
Yes, he would. Yes.
Jackie McCullough, how she was able to, she goes verse by verse in her preaching, but she was able to lift the contemporary context as she moved through those verses. Cecilia Bryant had a major impact upon my preaching. The spiritual process, in that John Bryant, of course, in my preaching, he's a trapdoor preacher. It starts out like this is a nice little story, and then all of a sudden, bam, the bottom falls out and he got you, right? Yeah, and you just caught right up in it. So I grew up in Baltimore preaching. I'm talking about cutting our teeth in preaching with Walter Thomas, Harold Carter, John Bryant, Cecilia Bryant. I mean, like, wow. I mean, that was like the creme de la creme of preaching.
Charles Booth, I imagine.
Charles Booth, oh yes, oh absolutely. Charles Booth would come to Walter Thomas's church every year right at Thanksgiving, and of course we're supposed to be right there, listening and gleaning and taking all this stuff in, so it was wonderful.
So how would you describe your preaching? What kind of preacher are you? How would you describe your preaching?
I didn't approach preaching the way we were taught to preach. You are antithesis. You exegete the text first, and then you tag it with the hermeneutic transfer. I just didn't approach it that way. Remember, I grew up in a different church setting. And I don't remember one sermon I ever heard preached in my youth. Not one. And I was a church child. I mean, I was there. I belonged to everything, I sang in the choir, did all of that. I was a church child. But I don't remember hearing one sermon that resonated with me until I got to Bethel, Baltimore, and heard John Bryant preach. He preached, "Where's the beef?" I can understand where's the beef, but what does that have to do with the Word of God? And then he would bring it forward to you, go like, ah. And then the tyranny of the pits, okay? Pit consciousness, pit language, pit friends, pit everything. Joseph's in the pit. I got it. So when the Lord began to, like I said, I started talking more than playing music. And people would invite you, because you were on the radio, to be at these gospel concerts. And so you have to introduce these artists, and you have to do that. And I open my mouth, and all of a sudden, I'm preaching. I don't know I'm preaching. And then people just stop and they listen. I said, oh my God, what just happened? Something happened. And I don't know what's going on here. And others do it a whole lot better than me, but I start with the hermeneutic transfer. For me, the question is paramount. What is the question that the gospel begs us to ask? And then we spend the rest of the sermon answering the question with the gospel. So that's not how we're taught. You know, the professors would tell you, you don't abandon your text. You know, you start with the text. But for me, I found that when I began with the text, I've lost them. They're not there for me. Right. You know, they've fallen asleep. They don't want to know about the eschatological reality of the whatever. So I start with the contemporary and then bring them into the word and then end with these are your takeaways. So here's your question. Here's the gospel that begs to ask the question. Here's how the gospel answers the question. And now here are your 3 takeaways. This is what you can take home with.
So tell me about a time when you were preaching and the Lord did above and beyond what you could have ever have dreamed that preaching could do, and you just knew it was God. You felt God really used you.
Well, I guess the first time that happened was my trial sermon. That was when I was legitimately preaching, right? This was I'm preaching. And really it was just, before it was just like, you know, somebody would, you know, because I was on radio, they would just invite you to whatever. Right. And they
MC.
Right, you know, and they just expect you to say a little message, and, you know, and I was doing the spiritual vitamin, so I could do a little something right then. But in preparation for my trial sermon was a lot of prayer. I said, look, I've done all these things in my life. If this is you, this is what you want me to do, then I'm not looking to do nothing else but this.
Would you back up a minute, and for my part of the audience that does not know what a trial sermon is?
So in the process of being, in the ordination process, a part of the task of the pastor and the congregation is to discern your spiritual gifts. So in order to discern your spiritual gifts, then there has to be a preaching moment. So it's called a trial sermon, or your initial sermon. Right. And it's preached before the congregation. And the stewards of the church, who are supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the church, sit in discernment that if they can hear God from you. Right? So prepared the sermon. It was a hot summer June night. My mother was there. The church was filled. I was surprised, like, all y'all showed up. I just eschew protocol altogether, right? You know, you're supposed to be in black, skirts to your ankles, no makeup, severe hairstyle, you know. And I was working all day, you know. I had to work, and so I came in a lavender dress, heels, you know, the whole 9 yard, right? And I stood to preach my trial sermon, and something happened. I'm in the middle of, the title was The Real Thing, and in the middle of it, people started to applaud, and it startled me, and I stopped. And I just, okay. And so I'm a manuscript preacher. I started out, I still am. You know, I'm a journalist. I write stuff down, right? So I go back to where I was, and then the place erupted. I didn't know what to do with that. And I said, okay. And then preached, and then something happened within me. It's like a takeover. It's like really a takeover. I'm talking But it's not like an out-of-body experience, but it's as close as you can get. But it's running through me.
Right.
It's not something that I'm reading. It is just running through me and running away with me. And then at the end, when I stop, everybody's on their feet, everybody's praising God, people are falling out, somebody's running around the church. And I'm going like, what just happened here? I don't know, that it's just what just happened. And then, so of course my pastor says, you gotta open the doors of the church. I don't know how to open the door. I've never opened the doors of the church. I've watched him open the doors of the church. What am I gonna do? So you open the doors of the church and people gave their lives to Christ. And I'm going like, wow. One of them was a longtime friend. We went to school together. And she stayed at the altar and she said, I never believed in God until this moment. And she's in tears. Now we're all in tears, right? And at the same time, another woman in the church came to the altar and announced she was called to preach. I'm saying, this is certainly not Vashti. Right. It certainly is God. My mother came to the altar because I'm watching her. Because she was like, Vashti, you're just ODing on gospel music. This is a phase. It'll pass, and you'll go on to something else. Of course, I'm a sweaty mess, right? And my pastor comes and puts his cloak over my shoulder. And I watch my mother's face. She just like, and then at that moment, it became real for her, that this is not a phase. This is not a passing fancy, that this is for real. And she came to the altar and told me so. And so like, then a grown-up time, I'm preaching at a convention, and usually when you're in a convention, they have ecumenical services, but it's basically a secular event, secular conference. And my pastor always opens the doors of the church no matter what it is, whether it's a conference, whatever. And I do the same. I do the same. So I'm sitting there saying, this is not on the program, it's not here, it's not there. And after the summer, this is a full convention center. You're talking about 10,000, 11,000 people. And it was hard enough preaching, because you just don't know how people are going to take it because they don't come to this convention for a spiritual experience, for a Christian experience. And at the end, I opened the doors of the church, and 200 people gave their lives to Christ. And I'm going like, and I go back to my hotel room and lay on the floor. All you have to do is just lay out, just lay on the floor. And my pastor would say of those moments that this is your most vulnerable moment. And so you pray for God's protection over you, over your family, over the things that you love, that you hold dear, because you're wide open. You have just emptied yourself out and you're wide open. And so you go and you lay prostrate before the Lord and you ask for God's protection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Wow. Let me go to the other side. So give me a time when it was the most difficult time for you to preach, just for whatever reason, whatever personal, church, whatever, that the most difficult time that.
When my mother passed. When my mother passed. And it was when you're pastoring a 100-year-old church, you have a goodly sized number of elderly people in your congregation. And it came a point where, you realize the age of your parents, right? You realize, and my father had died a year earlier. And you realize with the age of your parents that it can become real soon. and I'm preaching, one of our seniors died. You go to the hospital, you visit him or her, go with the family, help navigate the family through the process. And now you're standing, and all of a sudden you get this sense that, this is how it's going to be when your parents die, when your mother dies. And so my mother died suddenly. She was not sick. She died the way she wanted to die. She said she didn't want to die alone. She didn't want to die at home. She didn't want to have a lingering illness, be in a hospital or nursing home for a long period of time. And God took her just like that. She just dropped and she was gone. And I have enough sense not to preach a eulogy. Didn't preach the eulogy, but 12 members of my congregation died in succession after the death of my mother. And so it's sort of like, it was like, for the next 3 months, I was preaching eulogies. And it was hard. And then turn around Sunday and go, hallelujah, amen, right? And it was painful to preach. And finally I stopped and said, God, you just got to stop. Stop. This has just got to stop. And he did. So I said, were you waiting for me to say this got to stop? Or what? But it was painfully hard to be able to preach through that.
Yeah. If you will allow me, I want to go to Stan. Mm-hmm. I think my motive is to memorialize him and his role in your life.
Oh, yeah.
It wouldn't be without him, you wouldn't. So I just want to give you whatever, however you say, whatever you say, I want to talk about Stan just so that we remember him and honor him for what he has meant to your life, because you've blessed all our lives without him. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, he is really, besides the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, he is the one that helped make all of this stuff possible. Stan and I were joined from the hip from the beginning of our lives, and so we were before I was called. We've been married 10 years before I answered my call to preach. And the way we lived our lives together was that he had dreams that he wanted to pursue. I had dreams I wanted to pursue. So it was sort of like, I'm going to help you achieve your dreams, and he was going to help me achieve mine. His ego did not deny me being who I was or who I was becoming, and my ego did not deny him of who he was and who he was becoming. So we were that before called into the ministry. And in that call, I remember when I went home that night, what I knew, I came home that night and said, okay, babe, this is what the deal is, and this is what it's gonna mean. I am at the top of my game. I mean, I'm talking about, I am making more money than I ever made before. I'm corporate vice president, and I'm getting ready to tell this man, I'm getting ready to back out of this position so I can go to seminary. Yeah. And he says to me, he says, I feel God has taken you away from me. I'm already sharing you, but I feel that God has taken me away from you. And my response to him was, I said, no, God is taking us together. And God is calling me, but God is calling us. Your role may be a little bit different than my role, but God is calling us in this together. So the question is, are we going to us this together? And his answer was yes. And so you can imagine what that's like, being the first woman pastor and him being the first gentleman. Right. And so he was very supportive of home, very supportive of the call, very supportive through seminary, very supportive through 3 different churches, 3 different pastorates. My first was Chesapeake City. It was like 2.5 hours away from my home. Who drove that? My husband did. Drove us all over, because, when you start to pastor, you are inviting to preach in different places. And so we driving to preach in Delaware, driving to preach in Pennsylvania, driving back and forth. My mother went with me, So, I had great support. It's difficult potty training children on the road. And that's exactly what we're doing, because we had one child, but then we had two more after that. And so he was a great protector. Because you're in another environment. Here we are in another environment where people don't expect you to be. And sometimes people are hostile. They're very, very hostile. And so we worked out a system on how we enter into new churches, new pastorates. I would share with him, I said, sweetheart, people are going to come to you because they're used to talking to a man. And so how do you think we should handle that? So we worked that out. The people come to him, well, you know what? You need to tell your wife. No, you need to tell her yourself. No, you're the man in the family. You need to do that. I say, I'm the man in the family. Okay, but she's the pastor of the church, so you need to talk to her. But he was absolutely protective, and sometimes too protective. We had to little code looks. Don't rise at this moment. People are being angry and hostile. Don't rise at this moment, babe. Don't rise. Stay right there. It's gonna be okay. And then, because he was such a protector, he was watching out for things that I may miss. Because I said, I see this. He said, babe, but you ain't seeing this one over here. And so there were places he would move into, spaces he would move into that signaled to me that something is happening and I'm not seeing it. And so he would move in a certain way to protect it. People don't realize often the danger that you're in physically, not just emotionally or spiritually, but physically when you're in some spaces. I'm presiding, as a bishop now, I'm presiding in a space where someone was angry because they were put out of the church, and was demanding to come back in. I'm talking about a preacher, demanding to come back in. And I'm the new kid on the block. I don't know what happened in the past, don't know nothing about the situations. And his response to that was to show up to convince me that I should let him back into the church, was to come with him and his friends. Well, he's a state policeman. So now I'm sitting there presiding, and now there's a whole wall of state policemen with hands on their guns. And I see my husband about to rise. There's like, don't rise, let's just, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And it was fine. It was fine. Without me knowing the times in which he and the guys would get together. And I could tell when something was getting about to happen, because all of a sudden the whole front row, this front row, that front row, are all men. I said, okay, something's going on I don't know about. And y'all gonna tell me about it later, right? Tell me about it later, because for me, I was in the premise of if people feel that I have to be protected, that kind of a protection, then how can I move as a fearless leader where you have to be? Especially I'm in Africa, you cannot, you have to move, not forcefully, but assertively. You have to look like you're strong and be strong and talk strong, act strong. To do all of that, especially when you're in hostile and uninviting environment. And so one of our marshals was a female police officer, and she finally cornered me one day. She said, look, Bishop, all it takes is one fool. Just one fool. And so if you're not going to be concerned, we're going to be concerned for you. But we want you to be concerned for yourself. If not for you, but for your children. And so you say, okay, got it, no problem. But Stan the Man, that was, they call him Stan the Man. He was a major part of our ministry. And it is very difficult to, we ain't gonna cry, but very difficult to end your ministry without the one you began with. And we had plans. This is what we're gonna do. This is where we're gonna retire. This is what's gonna happen. I thought I had what I was gonna do. I started a leadership encounter for women. I've always done it, but it wasn't always called Sailor. It was the Circle of Love, whatever it's called. And I figured this is what I was going to do in retirement, and mentor other women, coach other women in leadership position. Found out that the men wanted coaching too, so it doesn't matter. Let's just do that, and that's we were going to go, and we were going to spend 6 weeks with one child and grandchildren, and 6 weeks with this one, and then 6 weeks where there's sun and beach and warm. But that did not happen. That did not happen. COVID hit, and I was supposed to retire from the episcopacy. In the Methodist tradition, it means you are retiring from presiding over districts. That's basically, you still preach, you still teach, you still bishop, but you're not actively presiding over a district. And when COVID hit, we couldn't have the General Conference. Well, General Conference is where you retire bishops and where you elect new ones. Right. And so we had to serve an additional year. So until 2021. Would Stan have lived? Possibly. If we had retired at the time we were supposed to retire. And it's different trying to hold a district together in a pandemic. I praise God for every pastor who was able to do it, every pastor who was able to pivot and shift their ministries to keep their congregations together. But what does that mean when you have more than 200 congregations that you have to help shift and pivot? I tell you, I spent the first month of the pandemic talking pastors back from the edge. It was traumatic for some pastors to close the church. Close the church. Liquor store stays open, and you close the church. It was very, very hard. And then those who were already in the digital world were able to pivot more easily because they were used to camera. Those who were just at the conference call level, it was very difficult for them. And then pastors, well, how do I preach? There's nobody there. How do I preach to the camera? How do I preach without an emotive response? How do I do that? And so that was a challenge there. But you have to remember, Stan was supervisor of mission. So how do you help missionaries do mission work when they can't leave the house? Right. And how do you keep thousands of missionaries engaged and not frustrated and not quit? And the missionaries are also responsible for the young people. So what do you do with young people who have never, ever, ever had this kind of trauma before, who are losing parents and grandparents? They were just dropping like flies. So not only would be difficult for the bishop, but it's also difficult for the supervisor to be able for Stan to do his ministry. So you think maybe he would have, maybe you just don't know. Yeah. But I'm grateful for 52 years of marriage. Grateful for 52 wonderful years. What a great man.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I want to, and it's not often that we get a bishop of your stature, place, and talk to us about the elevation to the bishopric.
Well, I believe that that you're called to preach, you're called to pastor, and you're also called to the episcopacy. Evangelists are called to do the work of the evangelist, but the episcopacy for me is also a call. I watch many people go, I'm going to do this. Oh, in 4 or 5 years, I'm going to run for the bishopric. What are you going to do, McKenzie? I said, I'm just trying to be 2 things: the best preacher that I can and the best pastor I can. I figured if I do those 2 things, I'd be doing real good and still be in love and charity with your neighbor and your family and intend to lead a life following the commandments of God. If I could do that, that would be very, very good. That would be very, very good. So the episcopacy was not something that was in view for me. I loved every congregation that God has allowed me to serve. They loved me back. I loved them. And I was loving where I was. There were people who other people knew, just like I said, with the call to preach, they knew, oh, she's called to preach. Well, I knew that. And then other people knew before me that I had the call of the bishop on my life. My pastor knew. And one day, we were at some conference or whatever, and I said, hey, Bishop, how you doing? Hug, 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 hug. And he said, Bishop. And it just like, I froze. I said, no. And he just simply said, it does not yet appear what you shall be. And of course, you grow a little further in ministry, grow a little further in ministry, go a little further in ministry, and you hear words and so forth and so on. And I said, I'm not putting my family through that. In our tradition, it's like a gauntlet. It's grueling on families, it can be grueling on congregations, grueling on your children, because your children are your children. And so they, you're not voting for my mommy or my daddy. You're campaigning against my daddy or my mommy. When our children are all interconnected, they grew up together, they're friends together, they're in each other's houses, they're preachers' kids. And who understands preachers' kids but other preachers' kids? And so I decided that that's not what it's going to be. That I was going to pastor Payne Memorial and grow that congregation and praise God for the growth, grow those ministries, praise God for the growth of the ministry. We were landlocked, let's purchase some property. We were able to get a 5-story, 56,000 square foot apartment building and turn it into a center for where our ministries could be housed. We were able to purchase another building with a commercial kitchen, 500-seat banquet place. I said, that's a whole lot of stuff to take care of. And grow the congregation. Our kids are getting older, they're getting ready to go to college, and one was already in college, the other was on the way. To do that. And I was very comfortable, Had a vibrant preaching ministry outside of my congregation. But God always has something else for you to do. And as the visions come, the visions come, this is what I want you to do. Okay, we'll go do this. Visions come, now you need to do this. Visions come, now you need to do that. And it had been my habit, it had been my tradition that after the annual conference where the bishops assign preachers to their congregation, I would close the books before we go to annual conference because, technically there is no pastor. I would close, tidy up the ministry, da-da-da-da-da. And when I come back after the annual conference, I would launch the vision for the year. This is our theme, this is our vision, this is where we're gonna go. So here we are, coming back after the annual conference. I'm standing in the pulpit and I'm outlining the whole deal, right? And all of a sudden God says, don't you see, the ministries I'm giving you are not for this congregation. This ministry is for the entire denomination. This is a ministry that is for an Episcopal district. What I'm giving you now, I want you to work out the details so that it could be replicated on a larger level. And I'm just like, tears. And rule number 1, thou shalt not cry in front of your congregation. Is it rule number 2, don't let them see you sweat. I mean, that standardized rule, right? Standardized rule. And I start to cry. So now my church administrator comes up behind me and says, God just called you into the episcopacy, didn't he? Yes, he did. He did. Had to do it so public. Why didn't he make this a private process? But so public. And my son is startled, and he gets up out of the congregation. He comes and he stands next to me because he says, something's going on. Mama, don't do this, right? This is not Mama's MO. He comes up and he stands next to me. And my husband comes up and he says, baby, I don't know what's going on, but whatever you need, we got you. We don't know what's going on. And so I finished laying out the process, and then that was when I said yes to God, to accepting the episcopacy, the call to the episcopacy, and then to prepare my family and my congregation for the journey. I knew that this was in 1996, and it seems with every loss there's a gain. That was the year my mother died, and now comes the call to ministry. When I began my first church, there was a loss. And right after that, I was assigned my first congregation. In 2021, my husband dies. In 2022, NCC comes to me. I didn't apply, didn't know the position was open.
NCC. National Council of Churches.
The National Council of Churches was looking for someone to come as a change agent to help them at a particular tick of the clock. And I didn't know they were looking. They came to me. And so here's this loss and here's gain. And so I knew it was going to take 4 years for the church to realize that they can elect a woman a bishop. Now, there have been women running for the episcopacy for years, since the 1960s, when women could be ordained itinerant elders. You had to be an itinerant elder to be a candidate for the episcopacy. People elect you. There's no select group, no group of people behind closed doors, like the conclave. No people sequestered and they come up and smoke comes up and they say, this person's going to be the bishop. That doesn't happen. Delegates have to elect you. And there are about like 1,800 delegates who come once every 4 years from all over the world. And they come to a general conference with many purposes to make and change laws, to elect bishops, and to assign bishops. And then the accountability, the stewardship accountability of the departments of the church. So I knew it was going to take 4 years to convince them, number 1, of the seriousness of my candidacy. 2, that the church is ready. 3, that the church is ready, that the church could elect a bishop, and then 4, that they would elect me. And so I announced my candidacy with the blessings of my bishop, and began that process of trying to convince the delegates. In order to do that, you have to go to where delegates are. So that means travel. It means going to Episcopal districts and presenting your case. There was already a process in how people did that. Sometimes they stood up and they told a joke and everybody laughed, said, oh, that's a good guy, we're going to elect him. Or they would sing a song. There were those who would sing and the whole church would go up and say, that's the good guy, we're going to elect him. Well, I wasn't a soloist or a singer, and I don't tell jokes at the drop of a hat, okay? So what do? I would tell them not just why they should elect me, but why my gender doesn't prohibit me from serving. So I ran on my track record. That's all I had. I ran on my track record, and my gender doesn't eliminate me. Same way as, you would look at David is not qualified to fight Goliath. He doesn't have the experience to fight Goliath. He's never been in a war, never been in combat before. He's not a trained soldier, but yet he was able to bring down Goliath. So don't let the size, the experience, or whatever get in the way. He's the one that can bring down Goliath. So I ran on that track record. Don't elect me because I'm a woman. Elect me because I'm qualified. Don't elect me as I'm a woman. Elect me because I have a track record that indicates what I can do in the future. And the lay organization, which they had done in the past, wanted to put together a resolution before the church to elect a woman, That means you would have to be elected first. And that resolution failed. Now, they did it before to elect an African, a Caribbean-born pastor, to elect him to the episcopacy. So they've done it before, this track record, done it before. So the only way we're going to get a woman elected is that we're going to have the resolution. Well, the resolution came before the whole General Conference and it failed. And people were coming by our delegation and say, McKenzie, hey girl, sorry, it's a good try, maybe next time. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to do some other things. I didn't see it as a failure. What I saw was 600 people voted for this resolution. It's going to take 800 votes for me to be elected bishop, or for any candidate to be elected bishop. All I need to do is go find 200 votes, and I got to win. What I saw was 600 people who were already saying, yes, this could be possible. And so on that night, the first ballot, no one was elected. I came second. Norris was first. I came second. Ingram was third, and Williams were fourth. We formed a ticket to say it's going to be the four of us, because there were 4 slots open. Let's stick together. You tell your people to vote for me. I'll tell my people to vote for you. And on the second ballot, I was elected. There was a lot of interest there from outside of the church, because I think it was the Southern Baptists who were saying that women couldn't preach or couldn't pastor or couldn't do something. Something happened with that group to that. And so everybody believed it wasn't going to happen. It just was not going to happen. But it did. And I stood on that stage. I didn't write a speech. Most people write a speech and have it. I didn't write any speech. With my family standing with me, my aunt came to stand in the place of my mother, to stand with me for that night. And I thank God, because it was a miracle that God would do that. And I stood not for myself, but for all of the unordained women, all the women called but were never affirmed, all the women who were called to pastor and never given a chance. That if God did this for me, then God can do anything for you. Just trust and obey. There's no other way.
To be happy.
Yes, with Jesus. If you just trust and obey.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a spectacular interview, and I can't wait till we release this out. The encouragement. Thank you for allowing us deep into your story, deep into your heart. We feel you, and we just thank God for your ministry, for the openness, for the truth-telling, the power, and of course, I've known you across many years, heard you preach many times, preaching gift. And I just want to say thank you that you've come and share, not only share, but share at this level with us. So God bless you, and we'll stay connected, and I'll keep watching. I know God's got even greater things. I appreciate you saying every loss has been a gain. I think some people are going to run around the room watching this video on that alone, about what God can do. And thank you for the story of the bishopric. It's fascinating, and you're the right woman for the job, the right person with skills, gifts. So I bless you and thank you.
Well, that's not the only shout as we end this part. The shout is, this is what God did for me. Right. But after me, 4 other women have been elected. You see what I'm saying? So, to get somewhere, you don't want to get there and you be the only one.
Exactly.
That's, the deal is, keep the door open for others who are. So after me came Carolyn Tyler Guidry, was elected, and Sarah Davis were both elected in 1 year. Of course, coming into that general conference, they said, no more women are being elected, McKenzie, so just get it in your heart and your mind that this is it. But then Bishop Guidry and Bishop Davis were elected after that. And then came Bishop Ann Henning Byfield, and then came Brookins, and then came Crawford. So 5 of the women have been elected. That's the shout.
That's the shout, right.
That's the shout right there.
Well, every good preacher got a second close. That's your first close, we went right. Now we get to the second close. So that is fabulous. And we do of sacred memory, Bishop Byfield. She was a great supporter of mine here in Indy, and so thank you for mentioning her name. We remember her as well.
Yes.
So God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you.
We love you and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.